Hello there. Today you find me in the rather grand surroundings of Chateau Bellevue in Saint-Emilion, and this is a chateau that's sort of out to the west of the town of Saint-Emilion itself. And the wine I'm looking at is from one of their neighbours, and this is the Saint-Emilion Grand Cru Chateau Coutet from 2019, and obviously not to be confused with the Sauternes Chateau Coutet, which is a sweet white wine. This area here contains a number of maybe slightly smaller chateaux that have been for a very long time in the hands of single families, and Chateau Coutet is a particularly good example of this. The David Beaulieu family, who own this estate, have done so for over 400 years now, and I believe Matthieu, who's the current winemaker, is the 14th generation of his family to be making wine here. The estate has 12 hectares of vineyard with 3 portions on different soil types. The highest portion above sea level is on a limestone plateau, and that's where they have their oldest vines. That makes up about a third of the vineyard. Another third lies on the slopes running down to that where there are clay soils. And then the final portion of the vineyard is on the flat where the soils are much more sandy. So they have a variety of geologies. But the David Beaulieu family really do seem to take the stewardship of the estate incredibly seriously. They're very proud of the fact that their viticulture is entirely organic. They've been certified by an organisation called AB since 2012. However, the practice of organic viticulture predates that by several generations. I think largely because the family weren't particularly wealthy and thus learnt to use practices that didn't rely on agrochemicals. As a result, they have a really diverse set of flora and fauna here. One of the creatures that they find on the estate are salamanders, which can be very sensitive to chemical use. And also they tell me they have a daffodil growing there, which is a very rare red version of a daffodil that was once common in Bordeaux, but is now less so because it was very susceptible to agrochemicals and the use of herbicides, and yet it still flourishes at Chateau Coutet. They're also justifiably proud of some fantastic old vine stock. Some of their oldest vines are over 100 years old, but I believe average vine age here is something like 50 years. But not only that, though, the family haven't planted clonal selections of vines here. All their planting is done using a massale selection, where they choose vines from within their own vineyard to propagate that. So over generations, this should allow the vines to adapt to the environment. I'm told they have a very old strain of Merlot here. And also, for example, they refer to their Cabernet Franc as Bouchet, which is the old local name for the variety. They also have Cabernet Sauvignon planted and another variety that they call Pressac, which is in fact, again, a local synonym, this time for Malbec. And winemaking is also approached very carefully to try and preserve the beautiful identity of the fruit here. Everything is handpicked, very gently destemmed. In fact, a proportion of the destemming that they do here is done by hand. Fermentation is done entirely with indigenous yeasts. What Matthieu will do is he will pick some fruit, crush it into a bucket where he will warm the must and allow a fermentation to start with the indigenous yeasts, and he can then use that pied de cuvee to initiate fermentation in all his other lots of wine. Fermentation takes place in stainless steel tanks. The indigenous fermentation might take a little longer than in some estates, maybe up to 3 weeks. And this can be followed by 4 weeks worth of maceration. Pressing then takes place in a rather spectacular old 100-year-old pneumatic wine press. So a large basket press. I'm told they did trials with a more modern pneumatic press, but found actually the quality of the tannins coming from the basket press was so much smoother, softer, and more refined that they continue to use this wonderful old press. When it comes to maturation, again, Matthieu works quite hard to try and preserve as much of the fruit in the wine as possible. Instead of using the 225-litre French oak barriques, which are fairly standard in Bordeaux, Matthieu's actually switched to using 400-litre barrels, as that will give a much gentler oak influence, while at the same time still allowing the slow permeation of oxygen into the wine through the staves of the barrel. And he will use up to 20% of new oak to age the wine, which will stay in barrel for about 12 months. So let's take a look at it, shall we? The wine has a really good, deep, dark colour to 2019 was a lovely ripe vintage, so that's not surprising. The wine has a deep, dark purple ruby colour and holds that colour really quite well to what is still a relatively purple rim, considering the wine has been in bottle for a few years now. It's 13.5% alcohol, and its tannic structure is enough to ensure that it's quite readily creating tears on the side of the glass. So let's see what we make of the aroma, shall we? There's a combination of an initial juicy, fresh, elegant red fruit. I'm thinking of mulberries there. Then there's a more sort of black fruit element, more loganberry. But it's that juicy nature that's really coming through. And then beyond that, there are some slightly earthy and slightly meaty notes. So let's have a taste, shall we? There's a ripeness and a richness evident from the outset. To me, this is dark red to black plum. There's that sort of richness. There's that high ripeness, sweetness, but also a good fresh acidity cutting through there, and a fine tannic structure that's slightly grainy on the front of my tongue, but then has a more sort of smooth, velvety, perhaps slightly chocolatey aspect as it opens on the back of my tongue. The alcohol at 13.5% is well balanced by the rich fruit. The wine is medium to full body. It's got quite a good structure, but that structure is relatively supple. There is some grip. The combination of the tannins and the very good acidity makes the wine mouthwatering. I think one of the things to know about Chateau Coutet is that the underlying limestone in the soils here really does help put good freshness into the wine that lifts the fruit beautifully. The fruit is quite powerful. Its alcohol and acid are well imbalanced. There isn't evidence of intense oak here, and the wine finishes with that sort of juicy, dark plum nature. This is clearly a well-made wine with some very good concentration. I looked at its Wine Searcher aggregated critic score, and that was coming out at 90 out of 100. And I think that's about the right score for this wine, because for all that it very ably shows its attractive fruit, it perhaps lacks the extra dimension and complexity that oak might give it. I still think this is a wine that could very happily age for 10 years, probably longer, probably at least 15. But instead of trying to produce enormous complexity, I think the aim here has been to preserve that beautiful, fresh, very well-defined fruit right the way through to the wine's finish. And it does that exceptionally well to provide a wine that's drinking really nicely at the moment. So thank you so much for watching the tasting. I do hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, do please press the like button. I'd really appreciate that. If you have any friends you think might like to watch it, please feel free to pass it on to them. I'd really appreciate your support in that way. If you've been watching these tastings and you enjoy them, do please consider signing up and subscribing to my YouTube channel. Having more followers would really help me to develop the channel further. And if you have any comments or any questions, do please pop those in the comments box below. I will, of course, leave a link to the Wine Searcher webpage for this vintage of this wine in the notes below. So do please follow that, find out where the wine's available and what its price is. So thank you again for taking the time to join me, and I do hope that maybe you'll manage to make some time and come and join me for another tasting in the very near future. Till then, bye for now.